Okay, good afternoon, everybody. You're very welcome to this second session today on as part of our sort of 6 week schedule. Earlier today, Dara was also delivering a session, and it'll be repeated again on Thursday, as with this session. So I suppose, as with all of the live stuff, if you have any questions, whether you're on Zoom or on our live channel on YouTube, please do throw in any questions you have, maybe into the Q&A if you're on Zoom, if you don't mind, and I can be kind of answering the questions as we go along. Yeah, let's begin. So I suppose today we're just talking about assessment and sort of broadly looking at your assessment options at MTU, Cork, and they kind of cross over a number of tools. Primarily, the tool you'll be using for assessment will be Canvas, but we're also going to mention an assessment option that you can use within Zoom as well. So just today, we'll try and keep it to the 40 minutes or just under, and we're going to look at three main things. So the MTU Cork assessment options chart, if you're not familiar with it, it's a really good reference for just knowing sort of what the main options are. Some assessment guidelines for semester 2, and we're also going to look at a checklist for assessment security and integrity. I suppose before we begin, there's a few really useful links to refer you to, and I suppose these are going to be referred to in the training session. So the remote teaching downloads are available on our site at tel.cit.ie. If you go to the remote teaching a link in here, you'll actually see a list of really, really useful handouts that were developed over the year to guide people on the whole remote teaching area, and they're really useful. Particularly, I'll be referring obviously to that assessment options chart, but there are other really kind of specific guides, including the quick guides, which I would refer you to if you're looking at quizzes, which we'll talk to you about in a minute. So all of those are worth downloading and just having as a reference. In addition to those, you're probably, after hearing about this resource already, but staff help articles is available from our site. If you go to the very top, you have staff help articles on top here. That'll bring you to a knowledge base, and in here we have a constantly updated knowledge base, and a lot of this stuff is based on what you guys are asking in your tickets and so on as well. So if there's stuff that hasn't been answered, it will be answered, and it will typically become an article within this knowledge base. And finally, then we have I suppose an archive of all of the recordings that we've developed over the last few years. But everything is nicely categorized for you in playlists. So if you go in here, you actually find stuff relating to Canvas, to Zoom, and also just other remote learning resources, and the EdTech series, which is something we began last week, and there'll be another session on that tomorrow. So they're well worth to look at, I suppose, just as a kind of a background to this whole session here. So the first thing we're going to look at are some assessment options. So I suppose to begin with, one of the primary assessment options that would be recommended in this remote teaching kind of period would be continuous assessment. But continuous assessment is just one of 4 different types of assessment. You have open book exams, time limited class tests, and you also have the idea of closed book exams. So I might go into each of those in a bit of detail. This is sort of overview detail, so we won't be getting into the mechanics of Canvas, but it's very much a lot of tips to do with assessment, and I'll be referring you then to guides that we have specifically on those different types of assessment options as well. So the first one is a continuous assessment, and this is the one that we really recommend as a sort of primary assessment mechanism. That would be that would comprise of 2 different types of assessment. It would be assessments or assignments in Canvas. So if you're familiar with assignments, you can have basically an area in Canvas where you get students to submit, and assignments in Canvas can be either just files that people upload, or they can be Turnitin assignments if you want anti-plagiarism checking on those. But by and large, assessments have the same, these continuous assignments have the same sort of criteria and in terms of time, etc., etc. But typically what you see them used for is lab reports, essays, portfolios, submissions, and don't forget as well kind of rich media submissions. So as we're all teaching and learning at a distance, students can submit video and audio material in as assignments as well, which is a nice rich way of submitting assignments. And the second continuous assessment option then would be quizzes. So quizzes in Canvas, using the new quizzes tool, allow you to create sort of automated quizzes or semi-automated quizzes. And those quizzes can comprise of different types of question types. So, at a very basic level, just kind of MCQs, but then you can have sort of formula-based questions, short answer questions, etc., etc. So quizzes are useful in that you, in either an automated or a semi-automated way, students can submit into those, and you can actually get immediate results back to you. And I suppose in terms of semi-automated, you have to maybe intervene in short answer questions where you have to maybe assess those. But they're really good for early on in the semester in terms of continuous assessment, in terms of building up different assessment activities. In terms of the steps for continuous assessments or assignments, you would typically look at just creating something in Canvas, student views it and subsequently submits into that, and then the lecturer assesses it. And if you're not familiar with the gradebook in Canvas, that's the area that you would go into and that you would review and mark the student material. And I'll come back to the gradebook in a minute, just in terms of a few tricks for that as well and tips. In terms of process for quizzes then, quizzes is kind of similar. So a lecturer creates a quiz. Oftentimes you'll actually have lecturers who co-create quizzes, and that's the nice thing about the new quizzes tool. So we'd often see that lecturers in departments would co-create a quiz, and they might do so offline. They might do it in a spreadsheet, a collaborative spreadsheet to begin with, a sort of a no-risk environment, and then start to add those in as item banks in quizzes. The real benefit of quizzes that I mentioned is that, you get to sort of have that automation aspect, in your quiz, but also, I suppose, you just save yourself a lot of time in terms of correcting if you have a mixture of different question types as well. Some require manual review, and it would be recommended that you would have some that would require manual review in terms of just reliability of those quizzes. And then I suppose in terms of reviewing them, you get to review those quizzes within Canvas again from the gradebook, and in the gradebook you can actually launch out those quizzes and the submissions from the students. Really important, I suppose, with quizzes. Not so much with assignments, because assignments are very straightforward in that you would have all probably used assignments at some stage already. With quizzes, especially when you were in a completely remote context, it's important to schedule a practice test with the students first. So that would just be maybe a no-risk quiz that you do with the students, using, again, new quizzes is the tool of choice in MTU, and that's going to become the de facto quiz tool within Canvas. Confusingly, Canvas have two quiz tools. You can forget about the first one, the standard or classic quizzes one, because that's going to be deprecated in the coming months. So that's why new quizzes has always been the one of focus in MTU Cork. So schedule a practice test with your students first. That could be with maybe just a limited item bank. Get them, I was mentioning it in a session last week in terms of group activities and discussions. Set sort of an expectation, get students to practice, see what the students come back with, what their experience was, and they can also feed back to you, and also review your quiz settings. I'll talk to you about that in a minute as well. So they are the two primary continuous assessment options within Canvas. Now, in terms of time-limited tests, Limited tests are literally quizzes in Canvas, but they have specific limitations in terms of how the students get to those quizzes and how long they have access to them. And I suppose there are a range of security measures in Canvas that are available in terms of making sure that students are taking those quizzes when they need to, and that they're also accessing them in the right way. And the steps in that process for time-limited tests are similar to those with standard tests. So a lecturer creates a quiz, they assign a time limit and a date and time restriction. That's the important bit. So you're basically having a time window within which the students take that quiz. The student access and take the quiz at a specific time, and then again, as with the continuous assessment process there, certain question types can be auto-corrected again, like MCQs, etc., and others require manual review. And really the main thing there is you're talking about time limitations here, and usually it is recommended that a lecturer would be at hand in chat, which is another feature in Canvas, the chat area, just to be on hand if students have any difficulties. So we all have to be maybe cognizant that students have maybe connectivity difficulties from time to time, or may have questions about a quiz if they're taking it in this sort of time limited way. So it's good to maybe be on hand in that sort of a situation, especially if it's high stakes time limited tests. So that's time limited tests, and it's important again to schedule a practice quiz with the students in the same sort of spirit as the first one that we looked at there, and review your quiz settings. And again, I'll talk to you about quiz settings there in a minute as well. So the next one then is open book exams. So open book exams are exams where students write down their open book answers or submit a piece of work, and that's usually done through the Canvas student app. So for those of you who aren't aware, I suppose you have a teacher app for Canvas and a student app for Canvas. And the student app for Canvas allows us to have a mechanism where students can actually capture their work and submit it to Canvas. And what's really useful about that is that you get the person submitting, you get their authentication through the app, who did it, they get to kind of submit it all in one assignment, and you get to be able to view all of that then in the gradebook as well. So the process is quite straightforward here. So if in an open book exam, the students have to submit something written, they would use the app. The student writes down their answers on some paper. The lecturer creates, I'm getting ahead of myself here. So the lecturer creates the assignment, obviously, in Canvas first. You have released exam questions at a specific time for those students. The students then write down their answers on paper, capture them with the student app, and then the student app can be used to upload those captures into the gradebook or into the submission area in Canvas. So what's really important about this type of exam is that students know exactly, again, it's like the other ones, I suppose students need to know how to do this. There are guidelines for students on doing these and submitting, but they obviously need the student app if they're submitting handwritten material. They need to have a smartphone, a charged smartphone with a working camera. Again, things you might take for granted, but just, I suppose, in terms of communicating the expectations around how a student is to submit, they're pretty important. And obviously some sufficient connectivity. Thankfully, connectivity is, the student app, and in submissions of images and stuff, that's not very bandwidth heavy, and so it'll be very uncommon to see a student that couldn't do this through the app, but they will need to have a bit of time to upload the material towards the end of the assessment. The final then kind of option in terms of assessment options at MTU Cork is remote proctoring. And one thing to note about remote proctoring before I ever mention the steps is that there is a requirement in MTU that proctored exams have to have a professional body requirement. That is, it is only available in cases where there's a third party professional body requirement for an invigilated exam or terminal exam. Because this is, I suppose, really because there is a lot around the process in terms of setting up proctored exams, in terms of authentication, security, etc., etc. So there's a good bit involved there in terms of setting those up. And then in terms of those steps, just in case you are in that kind of a situation where you do require a professional body professional body requires you to do a proctored exam, a lecturer sets a proctored assessment. So you set the assessment like you would set other assessments, but it would be set up in a particular way in Canvas via a third-party tool that does proctoring. And the student logs in and launches the proctoring application. They authenticate, so they confirm their identity with this proctoring service. So they have to have a proof of ID and a few security questions. The proctoring system then automatically records the student as they're taking the test. The student submits an assignment through this tool and in Canvas, and a recording of all of the on-screen activity that the student is doing through the whole session is obviously recorded and available then for review afterwards. So that's the last option there in terms of assessment options. So I've covered these 4 tabs, I suppose, and back to it again, I suppose it's going to be very much that in terms of how you can take or schedule the assignments. Continuous assessment is very much the most flexible and easier to execute, because you can do that throughout the semester, and you're not you're not kind of weighting it towards the final maybe time limited types of assessments like open book exams or time limited tests. But that said, 2 and 3 are obviously very doable as well. Various different versions of either assignments or quizzes. So I suppose just to go on to the next bit then, we were going to look at some assessment guidelines. And these are kind of generally applicable to all types of assessment that we're mentioning here. And they're really important, I suppose. One of the biggest things in terms of assessment is that we ensure that they're secure, that we're getting the right material to the students, that the right students can access them, and that we can correct them afterwards and give relevant feedback in a no-risk environment. So I suppose in terms of the key questions, I would ask myself if I was to set out an assignment. These are those, and these are available in the assessment guidelines PDF that I mentioned on our site. So one of the key things, and this comes across all of those different assessment types that we've talked about, are: have you communicated all of the relevant information to your students? Communication is really key when you're talking about any type of assessment or group activity or discussion. And communication will help in terms of how students will take these exams or assessments when they take place. And I suppose, again, if I was to mention any key thing, it would be to have a practice assignment for the students to take earlier in the semester, so they get very familiar. They're all going to be very familiar with it at this stage by and large, but we do know there are new modules, new programs starting from January onwards, etc. And it's good to have a refresher anyway. So if you need to do a practice test or quiz, it's very much worth doing that. But the key things to communicate with your students, and you can communicate these things not only through the assessment that you create within Canvas, but you can also communicate these things from things like announcements or from the inbox in Canvas. So the reason that's important is that just students will know exactly when something is happening and what to do. So the date and time and duration of the assessment, including when they can access it, any special instructions, so usually in the form of a brief. Big fan of detailed briefs as well. Detailed briefs will really save you a lot of time in terms of students coming back with any questions. And oftentimes in terms of assignments as well, it's maybe worth doing a special session. If you are delivering live classes, to do a special session or part of a class on the assessment in question as well, just to go through the brief and any formatting guidelines. And then how to contact you before, during our live. So I mentioned that in the context of the chat feature in Canvas. That's a really useful feature as well. I'm just going to take a glass of water, 2 seconds. So if you have any questions as well throughout, please do throw them into the Q&A if you're on Zoom. So I just mentioned contacting you before or during our live assessment, and that's really useful as well in terms of, in particular, things like the time-limited quizzes or assessments. Another key question to ask yourself is your assessment published and available to students? That maybe sounds like a very obvious question, but it is something really worth double checking before you're publishing or releasing or staging your assessment. So is it published in your settings? Is the available from date matching the planned sitting of your time of your assessment? So that's just worth checking. As with, when we're staging any learning material in Canvas, it's worth having a look at that as well. And then number 3, are your students able to access the assignment or assessment? So looking at your assessment and the module and the student view is a really good idea. I know there are certain things you can't see in student view, but most of the stuff relating to assessment you can. So that will allow you to see if the assessment is available to the students, that they can see it. And if you're using Zoom or proctoring, is it clear to the students how they should access these? And then finally, in terms of questions, key questions around assessments, have you ensured that students cannot see important files? Now, one of the important things is that we rolled out what's called the TL blueprint in 2020. So in September 2020, that would have been rolled out across all modules. And what that did is it set up default settings across all modules. They would include things like the files area being hidden, and they would also include the Zoom integration being available to staff and students. Now, the files area is hidden by default, but if for any reason that you have used it, some staff like to use the files area. If you're using the files area, make sure that you check on the visibility of the files associated with assessments. When you're setting up assessments and you upload a file into an assessment, unfortunately that becomes published right away. And so if you have the files area available in your navigation, that's actually a clear way of getting at that file early on, even before you actually have your exam staged. So within our staff articles, you actually have a whole section there. As far as I know, if I search for files, you can hide assignment files from students in our publish or in our knowledge base here. There's actually a section here on making it available from particular times until particular times, or actually unpublishing files as well. But as I say, the default option within Canvas, by virtue of this blueprint that has been rolled out to all modules, is that files are hidden. The files area is hidden. We did release a kind of an update to that blueprint only last weekend, on Saturday actually. So that released some interesting new features as well in terms of Zoom and stuff. If you want to check that out, there's an email out to all staff on that as well. Now, as I'm talking about Zoom, we're talking maybe just briefly here about Zoom for live assessment. So, this is a really nice form of assessment as well, where you can actually use Zoom for presentations, for live presentations. So the steps involved are a lecturer and a student agrees a date and a time. And typically the lecturer actually can use the scheduling tool within Canvas to have almost like a doodle poll where students can opt in for certain times. And you can have a very set number of presentations within a period of time. A really, really nice way of getting rich assessment material from students, because the students get to present using their mic, their webcam, a screen share, and they can actually, you can do it for presentations, interviews, performances, etc., etc. So the Zoom live assessment option is very much an option available to everybody. I would say, in terms of how you run it, there are a couple of things to be aware of. One of those is in terms of the availability of recordings. So one thing to be very aware of, I suppose, is if you're hosting sessions that are live presentations and they're part of assessment material, I would consider your recording options there. If you need to record it, which I suppose in every case with an assessment, you're going to have to record it. But if you don't need to, fair enough. If you do need to record presentations and review them afterwards, I would schedule those outside of Canvas. And the reason for that is because anything you schedule from within the Canvas interface. So if I go into Canvas, let's just say into a module here, a sample module. If I go into Zoom in here and I schedule a class, what that does is it schedules that class, but then recordings of this class, as you would know, become available in the cloud recordings area. Now, for presentations, typically we don't want those presentations to be available within this, unless there's an element of peer learning involved and you want the students to be able to review each other's presentations. But in the case that you don't want to do that, you can schedule your session outside of Canvas. So that just basically means you go to your meeting client, your Zoom meeting client, you create a meeting from that client, and then you share the URL with the students. When you record sessions from that meeting, they don't get posted into the cloud recordings area in Zoom. So that's an important one, and that's a useful tip in general if you don't want recordings being available within Zoom. Do note as well, you can obviously delete or hide recordings from your cloud recordings area if you did it in error. But I suppose just to be doubly sure, if you don't want something recorded into Canvas, schedule it outside of Canvas. And I think one of those scenarios would maybe typically be around presentations or assessment material. And, basically that will just mean you have access to the recordings from your URL. So that URL is telcit.zoom.us, and that will take you to your control panel where you will have the recordings all available to you there. So that's maybe just a useful tip in terms of using Zoom for live assessment. We also have some recordings available on our YouTube channel that cover this in more detail. So that's I really like this personally as an assessment option because you can use it in combination with other continuous assessment components to really get a flavor for what the student has actually produced as part of the assignment. The other thing, I suppose, just to be aware of in terms of requirements is the student obviously needs good internet, fair enough internet. I suppose Zoom is very forgiving with internet upload and download, etc., but that the student would be prepared, I suppose. And again, it comes back to one of those initial questions, I suppose, that I had a while ago is, have you communicated all the relevant information? That would include preparing the student to make sure that they can present using the Zoom app. And, all students have pro licenses in MTU. Cork, so they can actually start to trial that out if they want to in a no-risk environment in their own Zoom clients. Then finally, I just want to, in this section, part 2, I want to talk to you about accommodating student needs, and there's just two maybe primary things to be aware of here, and they are in Canvas quizzes. You have the ability to give additional time for individual students. So that's available in the moderate feature. So if you're giving students accommodations, so if students need extra time, you can do that within the Canvas quizzes interface. Also, in Canvas assignments, you have two options. So the first is you can actually create a version of the assignment for students with special requirements, special accommodation needs. So you could set one assignment. They can be identical assignment, but they'll just have different times associated with them. So you could use option 1 for that. That's basically just creating another assignment and just referring it to and assigning it to a particular individual or individuals in the class. The other option is a bit more flexible, and the one that I'd be inclined to gravitate towards, and that is just allowing your assignment to accept late submissions. And I suppose you as the lecturer will know that the students have particular accommodations, and you can review those afterwards, and maybe just in terms of communication with the students, let them know there are no automatic penalties, etc., etc. So that's worth knowing. I think this is more flexible. The first option maybe just requires more work on your part, and if you have a number of students, it just gets maybe a bit more unwieldy, but it's certainly an option as well. Now in part 3, I just want to talk to you about some assessment security and integrity guidelines. These again are available in our area here, along with other guides on our site. But if you go to just to look at some assessment security and integrity tips, I suppose these would be those. So new quizzes, in terms of settings, this is a really important one. Again, we all take certain settings for granted, including publishing and Canvas, but do, I suppose, double check in terms of quizzes that you restrict the student result view. And that's really simple. If you go into your settings in your module, so I'm just going to go to a quiz here. If you go to your settings, in a new quiz, you have the option here to restrict student result view, and basically what that does is it just hides all of the results. So in an automated test or quiz, students will actually get those results straight away if you have this unticked. If you have it ticked, students won't. They just get a message at the end saying your assignment is going to be reviewed. But I suppose with high stakes assessment, you're going to typically have this toggled here, and there's a kind of a guide on how to do that as well on our site there. And in terms of settings for assignments, I've mentioned it already, but just no harm in mentioning it again. Make sure your files area is hidden, so that's the file menu item in Canvas. So if I go to my menu in Canvas here for this module, I can see that files is hidden automatically in here. But if it wasn't, and you were you wanted to basically hide it, you go to your settings, and in the navigation pane here you can actually drag the files area. So it would maybe be inactive. If it was active, drag it into the inactive section. And this is actually worth knowing in general as well, folks. If, for instance, you had imported content from previous years, sometimes if you did a full import into Canvas, it actually brings the menu back to the way it was in previous years. So if you're ever not seeing something in the main menu, you have complete flexibility as an instructor to be able to drag stuff into the active area here for your module navigation. And then just final checks. Have you looked at your assignments in the student view? I mentioned that already. And then in your grade book, is the grade posting policy set to manual? So that is another thing in the blueprint that's been kind of rolled out to all modules. If you go to your grades area in Canvas, and if you go up to the cog here on the right, you actually have a grade posting policy tab. That should be on manually posted grades or post grades. That basically means that you can only post the grades when they're required to be posted out, typically after exam boards, etc. have happened. But if it's automatically posting grades, every time that you actually enter a grade, it'll actually get released to a student. So that's the default. And you have complete control then in terms of how you post stuff out. So over all of these columns here, you have manual. That means that the manual grade posting policy is enabled and students don't see it until you've posted the grades. Obviously, you'll want to post grades maybe for earlier assignments. I'm talking more assignments later on in the semester, which are summative, their final assessments. So I suppose they're the main final checks. Finally, as I always do in these sessions, I just refer to our support mechanisms here. So we have the 24/7 support, which you all are aware of, is tier 1 support. That's available from our help menu in Canvas. Our own one, tell.team@cit.ie. Please do feel free to email us there. And we have a team monitoring that all the time. And then for stuff that maybe isn't related to Tell, but things like web for faculty enrollments, etc., you can get onto web for faculty, or if there's other IT supports, service desk at cit.ie. So I'm just going to have a quick look and see if we have any questions there before I finish up. I'd say to keep it to the 40 minutes. We're just under it. No bother at all. Thanks folks. So I'm just having a look at YouTube and just see if there's anything in there. I do, I suppose maybe as a quick thing, these guides are really useful as a sort of a reference. If you have a printer, maybe worth printing some of these. They're really useful to have on your desk. If not, just maybe have them on your desktop. There's particularly the quiz ones and the security integrity ones. And as I say then, from our knowledge base, you have a lot of stuff available here. And then on our channel, if you do subscribe actually to the channel, that's a good way of seeing any of the stuff that's coming out, so you don't have to have a reminder in your Outlook or whatever. So I don't see any questions coming in, and thanks to my colleagues for answering any of the questions so far. There's been a few there coming in while I'm being on as well. So look, thanks very much for your attention, everybody. Hope you're all keeping well, and we'll have 2 more of these sessions on Thursday, and do look out for that session tomorrow with actually Dr. Dara Cassidy, who'll be doing a really nice guest speaker talk as part of the EdTech series. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.